When it comes to the anatomy, the hand is probably one of the most complex part of the body because it just is so packed with stuff. You can take a look at the arm like we've done before, or the different like the deltoids, or all those big groups of muscles like the pectoralis major in the front here. All those groups of muscles are really simple. They're big, they're visible because they have pretty simple functions. But when it comes to dexterity and being able to move the fingers in a bunch of different ways and doing a lot of different things with your fingers, it requires a lot of different things in there to be able to move all of these properly with the level of dexterity that we know we have. So when it comes to the anatomy of the hand, there's not going to be much muscle there. So that's not really what we're going to take a look at here. As you can see here, the muscles are mostly centered, mostly focused on the palm of the hand, and there's not going to be any muscle in the fingers. So those are going to be only the tendons. So they originate from a muscle, but everything that is going to be found on the fingers themselves is going to be just tendons, which is why you don't ever see someone with really like big hands or like muscular hands, more muscular fingers, I should say. So you can definitely grow these muscles, so the muscles of your thumb and then kind of like the hand. So the width of your hand can increase for sure, as with strength, but as far as the fingers themselves, they are never really going to change. Like I said, when it comes to the muscles, there's not much there. So let's take a look at the different bones, and especially if you've never seen a hand exposed like this without its skin. So there's going to be a lot of different bones here towards the center on the wrist, connecting the ulna and the radius to the hand. But we're not going to worry about those too much because again, they're not visible. But there's a couple ones that you should definitely be aware of. So the main bones of your fingers, the main bones of the hand. So those that are actually going to really influence the silhouette, the surface, and kind of how we draw the hand. So the main ones here are going to be these ones right here. So this is the metacarpal. Those are going to be the biggest bones in your hand, and they are mostly located in your palm. So they end right at the knuckles here. So, the tip of the metacarpals are going to be your knuckles. And now to the metacarpals attach what is called a phalanx. So you'll have 3 in each of your fingers. So you have this one right here, the biggest one, which forms pretty much half of the length of your finger. So the first joint, the distance to the first joint is it's actually a little bit more than half of your entire length of the finger, and this one's going to be called the proximal phalanx. And then you have this one, which is the middle phalanx, and the distal phalanx at the tip. And it's the same for all the different fingers except for the thumb here, which everybody's well aware that we have one less joint for the thumb, so you won't have the middle phalanx. You'll have instead just the distal phalanx and the proximal phalanx, and they'll attach the same way to this metacarpal. Now, before we move on to actually drawing the hand, there's one thing that's interesting with when it comes to the bones of the hand here, especially the fingers. And you can see here, whenever we look at a joint, the bone tends to flare out, right? So especially here, it's especially visible when you have the metacarpal here. You have this big ball here, and then you have a socket for it, which is going to be this phalanx right here. This phalanx is going to act as a socket, and as a result, it has to flare out to accommodate the ball of the metacarpal. So the result of that is basically at the joint, the bones are going to be a little bit wider, and they tend to narrow towards the center of the bone. So this means that at your joints, the finger is going to be a little bit wider at the joint and a little bit narrower in between the joints, basically. So if you're really skinny, the joints are going to be really prominent, and that's a feature of skinny hands. You see the distinct difference between the thickness around the joints and in the center in between. So there you go. Now let's move on to drawing the hand. So moving on in here in Photoshop. So when it comes to drawing the hand, The hands is, I wouldn't say that it's harder than drawing the face. It's definitely not, in my opinion, but it's very likely the second most challenging things to draw when it comes to anatomy. And for a simple reason, being that it's almost like an entire body of its own. So not, when you draw the entire figure, you're drawing the two legs, the torso, the head, and the two legs. And when you draw the hand, it's essentially the same thing. So you have as many different limbs, if you want to consider each finger a separate limb that can move, it can bend in a bunch of different ways. So in that aspect, it's just a very complicated, very complex part of the body. The whole point of this section here is going to be how to simplify it as much as we can so that we can draw it in multiple positions. So just like we've done thus far, but with the hand, it's going to be especially important to simplify things and to memorize a couple of proportions so that when comes the time to drawing the hand in a difficult position, because what we're going to see first is definitely not difficult, right? It's the flat hand, but it's important that we take a look at this before we can actually deform it and pose it in a bunch of different angles. This is what we are going to check out. Now, here are the different steps for coming up with the measurements of the hand. So there's a million ways, and there's probably as many ways as there are teachers when it comes to figuring out those different proportions. What we're going to start with is essentially two spheres. So the overall idea when it comes to drawing the hand is that I like to draw a mitten first, right? So it's something that's going to look like, so you have kind of like the body, right? Which is going to be the palm of your hand. And then you have all the fingers, which is going to be something like this. And then you have the thumb. So very similar to a mitten. And this is going to work for pretty much every scenarios. And also it makes sketching and figuring out kind of like the right position for the hand before you actually commit to drawing the details. It makes that possible. It makes that a lot simpler. So you don't have to waste too much time. And so here are the various steps. So first things first, we have to figure out the size of the hand. So the size of the hand, generally speaking, is, let's say you have a head right next to it, right? So we're going to draw a head. So let's say we have a head right here. The hand is going to go all the way up here. So it's not the entire head, so it's not as big as your head, but it's definitely pretty big. So basically from your chin to your hairline. So if you want to measure things properly, if you want to have a hand that works with the rest of your character, make sure that you keep those in mind, those proportions in mind. Now with that said, what we have here are two different circles. So we're going to start with two different circles. The two different circles are going to give us the full length of the hand, starting from the wrist to the tip of the longest of the fingers, which is the middle finger. And from there, we'll be able to pretty much create everything else and come up with all the different measurements. So once we have that, once we have those two circles here, it can be, you don't have to have the hand behind. You can just start drawing two circles like this. And from there, well, you start placing those knuckles. So the knuckles, the size of the knuckle is going to be approximately, twice the gap in between those circles here, right? So if you split that circle in half, it's going to be about this distance right here. So keep that in mind when placing the four fingers. And when it comes to the thumb, well, the thumb is pretty similar. It's just a slightly bigger circle. And those should all kind of originate from this ellipse right here. And again, if we want to talk in terms of measurements, the ellipse here should be about 1/3 of this entire circle here. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And it should fit, of course, should fit within that initial circle that we've drawn. And this is going to be that line right here for the ellipse is going to be where all those metacarpals are going to go attach onto. So if you trace the line for the metacarpals, straight down, and they all go attach onto that ellipse right here. So it's not going to be, for example, it's not going to attach to the same point here, right? It's not going to be like this. It's not going to be straight down. You trace the line here and you'll have all those bones kind of connect at an equal distance. So equal distance, equal distance, equal distance, equal distance here onto all the smaller bones here forming the wrist. now that we know kind of where to place those circles and how big they should be, this should be, the size of them is actually going to give us kind of the indication for the size of the knuckles, which is pretty important, and which also is going to give us the size of the width of the fingers. Those measurements, they're not random. The size of these circles is not random. It's kind of important that you get used to drawing them in the proper size. So again, for the most part, for most hands, unless your hand is like really, really stretched, where the fingers are like, your pinky is kind of like this and your thumb is kind of like this, even then, those circles here for the knuckles are going to remain in the same position. So if your finger extends, the metacarpal might move a little bit, right? But it's not going to go suddenly all the way up here. It'll stay there in that particular angle, and what is going to move, what's going to change is the angle starting from this point here. So the rotation point is the knuckle. It's not at the base here. So all of this to say, again, that these are not going to change position. Those 4 circles here are not going to really change. The only one that's going to move around is the one for the thumb because it has a little bit more of a range of motion. But those here, if you consider half a sphere, half a circle in between, you should be fine. Moving on, what we're going to do is draw kind of like the body of the mitten. And for this, pretty simple. You just kind of wrap around all the circles here for all the fingers. And then for the thumb, it's kind of a concave line instead, but still the line should flow from the side here all the way to the top of that knuckle. And then from there, you kind of just go down and join into like a nice circle here and then back up to finish up the basic, the shape of your palm. From there, we are going to add kind of like the limitations for the mitten. So this is where you can start to play around, so let me drop the opacity for this a little bit. In this case, you could have a mitten this big, or you can have another one that's, if your fingers are like this instead. So this is where you kind of indicate the position of your hand, the position of your fingers. If they're all clumped together, well, maybe it would be something like this instead. It doesn't have to be perfect, and the length doesn't have to be perfect. All that you need to worry about is pretty much making sure the line is not longer than this one right here. So this limitation here at the top, the outline for the second circle that we've drawn at the beginning, this is going to be kind of the maximum length for the longest of the fingers. So just make sure that the pinky, for example, is not like this long, right? So if anything, you can make it as long as the middle finger, and we'll chop it off later, figure out kind of like the proper size for it. There we go. So this is going to be what we are working with in this case. And then from there, what we need to find out is kind of like that line right here. So what is going to be the limitation? How are we going to close off that mitten? And this is an important line because it's going to give us a curve that we need to follow for kind of like for the rest. So this curve right here is going to be important. And to make sure we don't mess it up, this is what I recommend. So once you have kind of like the limitation of your fingers, once you know where your fingers are going to go, at least you have like a decent idea. Like in this case, I know, it's not going to go past that. So this is kind of like the overall shape that I'm working with. What you do next is you trace well, you don't really have to do that, but this is kind of where I'm getting that next line. You trace a circle or an ellipse starting from the middle knuckle here. So make sure that this ellipse is really nice and kind of follows, wrap around. Use this one here, use this knuckle as the center for the ellipse. So if your fingers are, for example, if they're a little bit more spread out like this, well, you're still going to use the center here. So let's say the thumb is like this. You're still going to use the center knuckle to create that circle, but instead of being an ellipse, it might be a circle, right? So it might be a little bit more circular. If all your fingers are kind of clumped together like this, with your thumb like this, you still use this one right here, and instead the ellipse might be a little bit tighter, a little bit longer, but you're still using the middle knuckle as the point of rotation. And now that we have this, we're able to trace this line here. So this curve is going to be pretty important. This is going to give us kind of the length of each of the fingers, and will allow us to figure out a lot of the other proportions for the rest of the fingers and the thumb as well. So now that we have this, we can kind of hide this portion here. And so now we have a pretty good mitten. And the next step's pretty easy and we're pretty much done. So now it's only a matter of subdividing this mitten properly to figure out kind of like the length and the position of those joints onto the hand. So we'll have a line like this. So if you can see here, we're essentially splitting this shape in half, right? So we take the length of this line right here, cut it in half. We take the length of this side right here, cut it in half, and then we can do the same thing here. So we can take any line here going like this and cut that in half, and then you trace a nice line following all those points, a nice continuous curve. So we want to make sure that you don't go like this or not like this and not like this. You know, it has to be a nice curve that flows. And this is going to give you the indication or the location for the end of the first or the proximal phalanges for all of your fingers. Not your thumb though. The thumb is going to be a little bit different. But we're not done yet. So we have one more line that we need to figure out, and this is going to be for the second joint of the fingers. And again, we're going to split the other portion in half again, which is going to give us this curve here. And for this curve, it's important that we continue it beyond kind of like beyond the mitten. Continue it and not break it again. You know, keep a nice flowing curve. And this is going to give us kind of like the length for the thumb. And then from there, we should have all the measurements that we need to be able to finish this off. So you can probably see here, there's a little bit of buffer, right? So between the tip of the distal phalanges and the outside of this mitten, which is normal. And when it comes to your fingers, to the tip of your fingers, you know, if you press on the tip of your fingers, you'll find it's a little bit, there's a little bit of padding there. So you're not touching the bone directly. So in reality, the bone ends at about the halfway point, and then you'll have kind of like your nail start right about here and then go all the way to the top and to the tip, not the top, the tip of your finger. So you'll have your nails kind of like this. And same thing with the thumb right here. And so this is normal to have a little bit of buffer here. So this is something that I haven't really mentioned, but when you do, you know, when you draw this circle here, draw it a little bit bigger, a little bit longer than the two circles that you had previously. And by default, you shouldn't have to think about that too much. You know, if you use the center knuckle here, well, by default, if you go all the way down here to the wrist to make sure that you within that circle that you grab the bottom portion of the mitten, by default, if you keep this in the center, this line here should be correct, and you should by default, without having to think about it, essentially come up with a little bit of buffer for each fingers here if everything is centered properly. There we go. So now, well, we are left with just the simple task of kind of drawing the fingers on top of this stuff. So we can hide the skeleton right here, and so we know that this line here doesn't really indicate much. It just indicates kind of like the start of the nail for the thumb, if anything. And now we know the location of all the different joints, so it should be pretty straightforward from this point on. So we'll know that, you know, the fingers start here, that they're about as wide as this, and then we can place kind of like you can start with just simple lines to make sure that everything's centered. So maybe something like this, something like this, something like that. Now to draw the thumb and to make sure that it's kind of in a proper position, again, we can bring this up again, this ellipse right here, make sure it's 1/3. And we know that the metacarpal for the thumb is going to attach here, right? So we're going to go from this point here, so the center, and attach onto the side here, kind of in a direct line. And so if you want to use this line here, it's a good guide to know kind of the range of your thumb, basically. So if you trace a line like this, it should be, this line here should be about as far this way that the thumb can go. Some people here have kind of like the distal phalanx a little bit more flexible, so it might, at this joint here, might curve a little bit more. But to make sure that the proximal phalanx is kind of correct, just trace a straight line here, or you can curve it towards the other fingers, of course, you know, if your thumb is bent, but you wouldn't have this, for example. That wouldn't be possible. So for this to happen, for this to work, you would need to take this entire joint here and kind of like rotate it down. And then you would be able to trace a line from here through the center of that knuckle and then outwards. So now that we know kind of where the line for the thumb should be, let's draw it. So we'll start from here and it'll go somewhere like this. So that's going to be the tip of the thumb. So from there, well, we can kind of drop the opacity for everything else. And again, you don't really have to do this every single time. This is just to figure out kind of the average proportion for the hand. The more you do this, the less you'll have to add all these indications. But it's a really, really good way after you've drawn the mitten to know kind of like how everything should be split. And it gives you really, really easy proportions to go off of. And so now we are ready to draw the fingers. So we know that they're going to start about this wide, and we can actually draw the other joints. So for the tip of the first, the proximal phalanx, this is going to be a little bit smaller than the knuckle, but still pretty big. So it's a big enough bone. So for the thumb here, right in the center, we have kind of like the full distance here. So that joint is going to go right in the center here. So we didn't have a guideline for that, but right in the center. So pretty straightforward. So yeah, about this size. And then those joints get smaller and smaller as you go towards the tip of the fingers, right? So the next joint here is going to be a little bit smaller, maybe like 2/3 of the previous one. And then the same thing here again for the tip of the finger. The tip of the finger really doesn't matter. You don't have to draw the joint there because there's no joint really. But yeah, we can use kind of like the last width of the last joint here to give us an indication of how wide the tip of the finger should be. So we just go like this and then kind of connect the dots, right? So touch the outside of each of those circles. Touch, 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 touch. Same thing here. And then we can start drawing the nails. So the nail's going to go at the halfway point here again, right? So from that joint here to the tip, I'm going to start right in the center. So go like this. It's a little bit narrower at the root, and then it kind of gets wider and wider as it gets towards the tip of the finger. So again, and then, so those fingers are all facing up. For the thumb, it's going to be a little bit different. The nail for the thumb is not going to go like this. It's actually going to be, so if we imagine that we have kind of like a cylinder for those fingers. So we have a cylinder like this for the thumb. So far, all the fingers have been kind of right down the center, right? So we have the nail right here. So very symmetrical. For the thumb, the symmetry or the top of the finger is going to be more tilted on the side here. So the nail will be more like this. It's as if it kind of rolled over. So for the thumb here, we can draw the finger as well. Goes the tip here, so something like that. And the nail, well, it's going to start again. If we consider that this line here is the center of the thumb, so we can draw it here. So this is going to be kind of like the root for the nail of the thumb on the side there. Now we would have kind of a proper hand. Next up, well, we can just trace over all of this and should give us a really nice finished hand in the correct proportions. All right, and so now if we hide this here, we can kind of finish off this hand. So of course this hand is seen kind of from the top, right? So this line here that we have for the knuckle is going to be important to give us the indication of where the palm is going to go. So we can actually kind of use that line to know where the webbing should start for the hand. So basically just take those lines here coming down from the finger and make a nice U at the bottom. You know, not too low, not too high, or like right on that line. And now if we hide this, so we can add with the bottom here, we can add kind of like the rest of the wrist, right? So we know that we have all those smaller bones here, and there is the ulna that's on the side here. It goes like this, and we have the radius that's a little bit bigger in this case. It goes like this. And so what we can do is kind of use that width for that, that ellipse here, this should indicate us how wide the wrist should be. And on the side here where the ulna is, it'll create kind of a small bump here for the hand. And on the inside, we shouldn't see it too much. Yeah, so there we go. So this is how we create a hand. Now for the top view, we'll be able to see a little bit higher here. We'll be able to see a little bit of the webbing, which is going to give us the illusion that the fingers are longer from the top, even though they're not really. And we can also use those knuckles here as a base for the actual knuckles that we are about to draw. So there we go. So, we can clean this up a little bit, but basically this is how you construct a hand in proper proportions. So it might have seemed like there was a lot of different steps, but I'll do it again really, really quickly to show you that it's actually pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But before I do that, real quick, I'm going to duplicate this over and we'll do kind of the inside of the hand, which is pretty similar, but we're just going to get rid of the webbing here on the inside. So we're not going to be able to see that. For the inside here, we'll create that line again. So that's actually going to be there. And we'll have kind of like the padding here for each of the fingers. Remember the different measurements. So at the halfway point, here we'll have kind of like the first joint where the fingers bend. And it's going to be all in the same line. We'll have here for the thumb. And then a little bit higher here. Again, split in half, split in half, split in half. Should give us the other fold, because on the inside of the hand, we have a little bit more padding. So if you touch the top of your fingers, this is where the bone is going to be. But on the inside, on your palm, this is where all the padding is for the muscles of the hand, kind of the typical fold that everybody has. As simple as that. So like I've just said, I'm going to do the same thing again now, but much quicker now that we know all the different steps. So to figure out the size of a hand starting from scratch, so all you have to do is start with 2 circles. This is going to give us the full size of the hand. We can trace kind of like a sphere here at the bottom, occupying 1/3 of the full diameter, and this is going to be kind of like the size of our wrist, the width of our wrist. And we also know that now we can start drawing the knuckles. So we'll have a knuckle here for the pinky, and then from there we can draw the outside of, or the body of that mitten, figure out kind of how the fingers are going to spread, and from there, using this circle here, we can start kind of like draw a ellipse using that as the center of rotation. So something like this. So it was somewhere along those lines, something like that. And as a result, again, this is going to be a little bit longer than the 2 spheres that we initially drew, but this is fine. The only reason why I draw 2 spheres at the beginning, if you're wondering, you might not have to do this one if you don't want to, but it's just before you start like measuring all the different things here, I like to have a good idea of kind of like the size of the hand, how much space it's going to occupy. So which is why I use those two circles initially. But now we can easily just get rid of that one. It's not going to be needed anymore. Can you raise the tip here? So this is going to be kind of like the outside line. Now we split that in half. So I'm going to figure out this is a half point here, half point here, half point here. So I know I have a nice curve that I can draw, trace, and then same thing again in half for the rest of the fingers. Not the cleanest line, but it works. Now I can draw the fingers. So I know that my thumb is going to go like this. Here, this is going to be the tip of my thumb, goes like that, and then I have all the different fingers, and yeah, now we have the nails here starting at the halfway point. I now have a hand in correct proportions, fingers in correct proportions, and it was pretty quick, like you've seen. So the more you do this, the more you can start to skip different stages, and at some point you'll probably be able to do kind of you draw kind of like the shape of the mitten first, right, like this. Then you draw the fingers, where the fingers are going to go, thumb, and then you can just subdivide those. And the more you do it, the more accurate this quick result with skipping those steps, the more accurate this should be. There we go. So this is how we figure out the
proper proportions for a hand. Now let's move on to something a little bit more challenging, which is going to be drawing the hand in different poses and in 3 dimensions. So right now it's been pretty flat, so more like 2D, more like 2 dimensions. Now let's add a third one in there and see what kind of volumes we're playing with here. So if we place the wrist or the forearm into this particular angle right here, right? So imagine this is the 2 different bones. So we'll have the ulna right here. You'll have, meaning that the pinky is going to be on this side, and then you have the radius here, and which means the thumb is going to be on that side. And now, well, this is going to where the attachment point is going to go. So we know that this ellipse, right? So the ellipse here is basically placed right there, which is why the tip of that shape, that volume is not straight. It's actually curved inwards a little bit, concave, just like it is right here. So same idea here. And then, well, to make that work, the palm itself is going to be something like this. Again, a fairly simple shape. If you want to think of something like this that exists in real life, you can probably think of like your mouse, your computer mouse. So it's very similar. So instead of being flat, again, it's not going to be a shape that's flat like this and then rounded at the tip. And it's rounded only so that it can like fit right here, fit in that socket. So the receiving socket for the wrist. And if we take a look at that ellipse again, so that ellipse would be somewhere around here, right? And so it's this shape, but instead of being straight like this, being flat on a table, it's actually curved like this. So it's as if you're pushing up like this. And then you have kind of like this nice curve going like this. And this is very typical of the hand. So as you can see here, if you just look at the skeleton in like a relaxed pose, you really get this curve like this. It's not flat. It's definitely not flat. And even from the side here, we can see the thumb. Most of the time, it'll be kind of on a different plane, pointing in a different direction. So it's always a little bit lower. So if you have kind of like the mass of the hand right here, the thumb's kind of pointing down a different angle. Now the next step here would be to draw the thumb, or at least a simple representation for it. And this is going to be a little bit tricky because the thumb can move quite a bit. It has but it has a wide range of movement. So it can start in this position here, or it can be angled this way instead, or it can even go like this, right? And so it's going to be a little bit tricky to try to explain this, but the way I like to think of that is simplifying it with 2 different ellipses. So we're going to have one, the biggest of the ellipses here, which is going to originate on the side, this like chopped off mouse, computer mouse. So we'll have the first ellipse here. Basically, we're trying to grab this whole thing here and the joint at the same time. So this is going to be the ellipse that we'll try to place. So it has to be in those proportions. So think of those 2 things here as when drawing the size for the ellipse. And so the size is going to go. This ellipse is going to start here on the side. So we can imagine, this side right here is the same side here. So it's going to attach somewhere on here. So the origin, however, is not going to be, so it won't be able to attach here, of course. It's not going to be able to attach down here. It'll always originate from the same spot. So we know that we have kind of like the wrist, the ellipse for the wrist here, and that thumb and that ellipse here for the thumb, that original ellipse, is always going to be oriented towards that here. So towards the placement, or you can always consider that kind of like the center of the wrist. That ellipse is always going to be oriented the same way, always along that line. So if the thumb is, if you open your hand some more, like this, for example, well, the ellipse is going to follow that same line. So it's not going to be like this. It'll always be cut along its length, right? So it's like a symmetrical line. With that said, now that ellipse, to place it in 3 dimensions, it's not too hard. So it's a simple shape, and there's basically one thing that you need to know to be able to place this properly. So if we look at it from the side view, right? So from the top or the side, whatever, this is going to be the ellipse. It's going to be a nice ellipse, nice and round and easy to shade. So it would be something like this. But the more the ellipse is pointing at us. So right now it's just pointing on this side. It's pointing this way. But the more it points at us, the more it's coming at us like this finger is, the rounder and rounder it will appear. So if it's pointing at us a little bit, it might be like this instead. So as you can see here, it's not as long. It's going towards more of a round shape. And if it's pointing at us a lot, it might instead appear as a circle. And then you would have, if we add kind of the other section for the thumb here, which is going to be another ellipse, pretty simple, an ellipse that's about, seen from the side at least, it's about 2/3 of this one right here. So it'll be about this much. So seen from the side, it'll seem like they're just touching, but at an angle, if it's looking at us, if it's pointing towards us, then maybe it'll start to overlap in this case here. And when it's pointing directly at us, it might seem like the two ellipses are kind of on top of each other. And then you would have, the nail here for the thumb, right? So it would be like this. So that would be a thumb that's pointing at us directly. And in this case, here the nail would be maybe like this. So it would be pointing at us a little bit, but not completely. And then in this other case, it would be just basically laying flat on a surface. So it wouldn't be deformed at all. But the more it's pointing at us, the more those ellipses turn into circles. So just something to keep in mind. So if I'm to draw these on here now, always make sure that the ellipse is oriented towards the center of the wrist here, right there. Straight line from here towards the center, through the center of that ellipse. If it helps, you can start with a straight line. So we start here at the base of the palm, draw a straight line, draw a straight line. So we'll have the first ellipse, maybe, so it would be the first one. You can have another one here. Make sure that's always pointing in the same direction, and another one down here. So I'll do one at a time. So we'll start with a more relaxed position. So this would be a very basic representation of the thumb. So it doesn't look like much right now, but we have some pretty good proportions already without really thinking about it much. I think the hardest part when it comes to drawing the thumb is figuring out how the nail is going to be oriented. So when the arm is kind of straight in front of you and your thumb is not bent, so there's no bend here. When it's straight, that nail is going to be facing you most of the time. So it'll be facing this direction. So what we can do now is kind of adjust the shape of the sphere in consequence. So as you can see here, when it's facing something, it's more like a bean, right? The thumb, more like a bean like this. And that bean, that curve for that bean, that concave part of the bean is always where the nail is going to be, and it's always where it's facing. So in this case, it's facing us. Well, that bean is going to be more like this here. So we'll have the concave part on this side. And in this case, well, the nail will be right there. So we wouldn't really be able to see it from this point of view, from this angle. Now, finally, to finish off this thumb and kind of attach it properly to the rest of the hand, well, what we're going to do is hint at the knuckle here, not the knuckle, hint at the head, the tip of the metacarpal. What we made sure to grab with that initial ellipse that we drew. So we're going to draw that here, and then we can figure out, so the tip here, this is where the joints are going to be, so we can go and join in with the rest of the hand. And this is going to give us kind of like a small curve here, so going from this joint to that one. So we'll have a slight curve inward, so a slight concave curve. And from there, this is also going to give us, if we start right about the center, and the center of that joint here, we can create a nice line here that flows with the side of the arm, the side of the hand here. So of course, it's not going to be as pronounced, but it should be something like this. And then this is going to give us the indication of where that fold should be. And then we can start to kind of fade it like this. So just like that. And then the bottom here we'll want, to get back kind of like that mass here for the muscle of the thumb. And well, we can also use that circle here for the joint. So we start from here, we continue that line, and kind of go all the way down and towards kind of the base here. So the center here of the wrist. So a nice circle that kind of touches at all of these on the outside here, wraps around here, and continue. So make sure that the circle, the ellipse or the circle is a nice continuous one. So that's not a circle. Make sure that's nice and round, just like this shape is. So now this is super messy. So let's clean this up a little bit. So what we can erase here is the top portion here. And we're going to use the bottom line here for that shape here, right? The palm. So this is going to be the correct line where it meets with the thumb. And this is going to go back up like this. This is how you attach a thumb properly. So a little bit complicated, granted, but we're going to do that again with a thumb in a different position. So in this next example here, in this next position, what we're going to do is have the thumb like facing down all the way here as if this person was making a fist. So we're going to start with the same idea. We start right here and we trace a line towards the outside here. So it's a line that has to connect, at some point with this line right here. So there we go. So now it's oriented properly. And then we'll draw the other ellipse. Maybe this one's not long enough, but close. Now the other ellipse, well, it's going to be pointing in a different direction. So we'll have the thumb. So if this is kind of like the top of the thumb, right? We'll have the other ellipse pointing in this way. So this is going to be the line for the symmetry of the second ellipse. A little bit lower. There we go. So now we can erase all of that and we can start to clean this up a little bit. So I know that at this point here, we're going to have a nice sharp angle because that's where the knuckle is. And then once again, we'll want to grab kind of like that circle here. And now I can start to close these lines. So I know that I'll have like a bump here and then back up. Keep the bottom line again because that's going to be useful. So this line right here, so we can keep that. That's still going to be accurate. So we know the top of the thumb is always a little bit concave, like it is here, like it is here. So slightly concave, and then it's round, so round, concave, concave, convex, concave, concave. Right, so same thing here. So convex, concave, concave. And well, this is pretty much it. So we now have, this would be kind of like the muscle part. So this part right there. And there we go. And then the nail, this is the top here. The nail would be somewhere like this. And well, we would have a thumb in a different position, but it'd still be placed properly. Okay, so now let's move on to the actual finger. So for the thumb, quick recap, it's 3 different spheres. So we have 3 different ellipses. We have the first one here that we need to figure out. It's going to be the one that grabs the joint here for the thumb and also touches at the first joint. And we have a smaller one, which is about 2/3 the size of the first one. And then we'll have another bigger one, a bigger chunk that if the joint is right here, what we need to do, this is going to be the last one that we do, and this is going to be the section that connects the thumb to the rest of the hand. And this one, well, to figure it out, we just have to draw a nice circle, making sure that we grab this and that we touch here at the base of the wrist. So it's going to be a circle that uses those 2 points. So something like this, right? You can see it works really well in this particular example as well. And so those are going to be the 3 different ellipses that we need to worry about when we draw the thumb. And then of course, making sure that we are able to place those in different angles so that we can bend the thumb in a bunch of different ways. Moving on to the other fingers now. So the other finger is going to be pretty straightforward in comparison to the thumb at least. So the first thing that we need to find out is going to be the shape of the ellipse for the first portion of the fingers. And this is going to be, at least for most fingers except the pinky, which is going to be a little bit smaller, but for most of the fingers, it's going to be the exact same one that we've used for the thumb, more or less. So what you'll want to do here is trace an ellipse here starting from any of those positions here. So if we have kind of like the hand like this, split up like that, well, we'll have first finger, second finger, third finger, and pinky. So place them at equal distance from one another. And then we can use that point here as the start for all of the different ellipses, or use each of them as the start for their own respective ellipses, I should say. So there we go. So we have the first one here. So first ellipse, second ellipse, third ellipse. And as you can see here, the ellipses seem like they're kind of like overlapping, right? because we're looking at this in 3 dimensions. So the one that's closest to the camera here for the first finger is going to be, at least it'll appear like it's in front of the other fingers. Finish off the fingers with a slightly different shape. So it's not going to be quite an ellipse, it's going to be more like a bean. So very similar to what we did with the thumb. And this is what we'll use for the last two bones in each finger. And if we look at this really quickly, you know, like we've measured before, this first ellipse here should be the same as the second one, right? So it's the first knuckle here. It's not quite that, but when you look at the fingers without looking at the bones too much, so let's say the fingers begin here, it's right at the halfway point. So that first, where that first ellipse ends, it should be at the first knuckles, not the first knuckle, the first joint of the fingers. And then we can draw a bean connected to that. So right now, since this is at a slight angle, so the bean will appear like it's overlapping the tip here where it connects to it. If we were looking at it from the top, it will be just the first ellipse, second ellipse, same size, right? If we were looking at it from the side, we would have the first ellipse and then the second ellipse, which would be more like a bean, be the same size though, but it'd be kind of like this, right? So like a bean shape. So this is what we're going to draw now. So first bean like this, make sure that the ellipse, you can start with an ellipse and then kind of sculpt it to make it into a bean. And of course with the pinky, I want to make sure that's a little bit shorter. All right, so now that I have something that looks like an ellipse, I'm going to just start to sculpt that, you know, starting from the joint here. So we have the joint, the first joint, going to be like this, nice curve. So we want to make sure that starting from here, we have a nice bean shape instead, back below. And then this is where you kind of adjust the length of all those different fingers based on the proportions that we've seen so far. So the first finger here a little bit shorter, the middle finger a little bit longer. Now with these beans, what we can do is split them in half like this. So this is going to give us the indication for the last of the joints. And then you can split that in half again. So if we consider that this is kind of like a cylinder, right? The tip part is a cylinder. We can chop off the tip here. And half of that cylinder, this is where the nail is going to start from. So we'll have kind of like the nail here, go like this, wrap around. So now we have a little bit of cleaning up to do, but essentially we'd be done. So this is how you do all the different fingers. Now, of course, if you have some fingers that are a little bit more bent, then you might want to change the shape of that bean, right? So if the finger is bent instead, you know, instead of being a bean like this, well, the bean will be bent, right? So we'll have the nail here where it was here before, but in a relaxed pose, you know, it'll be more like a bean shape seen from the side. And then from there, what I recommend is that you draw the fingers as the tip of the fingers as long beans, and then bend them if you need to. But it's a lot easier to get the right proportions this way. And then, yeah, let's just clean this up. And now the fingers look a little bit too short, but that's normal because they're not properly connected to the hand. And all we'll need to do here is kind of continue the line. So instead of having go back in to follow the curve of the ellipse, we can erase that. And we can erase that big line, that big guide that we had. Actually, not too much because we know that this is where the knuckles are going to go. What we can do is just have the line continue and touch that line instead. And this is kind of how you draw a hand. So now it's all about adding details if you want to. It's all about kind of just cleaning this thing up. So now like the connection to this finger here, I can keep that edge here because that's kind of accurate. So this is going to be kind of like the indication for the fold. But then of course we'll erase all those sharp lines. Then we can add an indication for the knuckles. This is kind of how I approach drawing the hand in different positions. So whenever there is perspective involved, this makes things really easy to just play around with two different ellipses. So we're not worrying about all the different joints. It's just two ellipses, super simple. The other one that we kind of tweak to make it more like a bean, like this, like I've said. The result of that is a pretty accurate sketch. So it's not going to be a final image. Of course, you know, this is still pretty messy. So it'll be a lot of cleaning up to do there, but it should give you a pretty accurate hand. So now that we know how to draw the hand and the fingers in in perspective, let's look at how the hand actually attaches onto the wrist. So this might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it's a particular feature of that attachment point that we need to take a look at. So seen from the side, because that's going to be a little bit more obvious, if we have the wrist like this, the hand is not going to attach at the same level here. So it's not going to be a straight line at the top. It's going to be a small dip. So it's almost as if there was like a step here. So that's something that you should always consider when you draw the wrist and the hand. There is always a step like this. And of course, it's not going to be like a sharp step like this. Instead, we'll blend it nicely, because that line here at the top of the hand is always a nice continuous line. But it's important to know that there's going to be a small dip. So if your hand is completely straight, right? If you're trying to stretch your arm as far out as possible with your hand, with your fingers pointing out as well, your hand's not going to be completely straight. Instead, it's going to be more like something like this. It will seem like it bends down, and then the fingers themselves are going to actually be parallel to that line, but it's going to be more like this instead. So you have kind of like that. So if we look at the different parallels here, so we'll have kind of like this line here, so straight line, and then the fingers might be straight as well, but there's always going to be a dip before that. So if you're trying to stretch your arm as far out as possible with your hands pointing like this, with your fingers pointing like this, you'll clearly see this change of plane here. So go down and then straight again. It's not going to be a continuous line. And there's a reason for that, and that has to do with the skeleton itself. So if you look at the bones here, well, what we can see is that we have kind of like this empty space here right after the bump for the top of the wrist, right? So this bump right here, and this bump right here. After that bump, after that highest point, there's kind of an empty space here. So the skin will go down and then kind of join at the top here for the knuckles. But this portion here is going to be slightly concave, and it's going to be a clear change of plan here, kind of like a break between the different planes. And so if we look at that from the top view, what this would look like is kind of like as if the hand's going into this shape here. And then you could add a little bit of shadow there, so something like that. And if we look at it from the front here, again, we'll have kind of like this stair, this change of level, and this is going to be represented here by, we'll have to adjust that line so that it flows nicely from the wrist onto the hand, but it's going to give us this little bump here that we'll see from pretty much every single angle, and that is going to be correct. So this is what we need to pay attention to. We need to make sure that we add that. Now, of course, if that hand is instead kind of just, bent like this, well, you won't see the dip as much, and going like this and down into the fingers, and then the line will break on the other hand at the bottom here, where the bottom of the wrist kind of meets with the mass of the muscle for the thumb. So you have a clear break here and a nice flowing line at the top. So that's usually how it goes. And yeah, there we go. So this is just kind of a small detail that we have to pay attention to when drawing the hand. So it's not a straight line, and it's important to really represent those bones here and how they end in the wrist and how they connect to the hand. So finally, we are going to take a look at another example using this technique here. So how to draw a different hand in a different angle using the same idea. So what we're going to start with, again, we'll start with the basic shape for the hand. So in this case, I'm going to go with something like this. And it's always good, when you start, before you actually commit to building the hand, to building it like this, always good, like I've said before, to draw kind of just a mitten to get an idea of what your hand's going to look like. So just a quick sketch, right? So something like this. And it should give you a good idea. And again, make sure that you draw the wrist, because that's going to influence kind of like this bump right here. So I'm thinking maybe something something like that. Right, so this is a super rough version of the hand, but you can tell, you know, the fingers are going like this, going like this. Even though it's super simple, I kind of get a good idea of the position for this, you know. And then, so now that I have an idea of what I'm going to do, now let's actually build it. So we're going to start with the position for the hand. So I'll call this kind of like the mouse, the computer mouse part. So we'll have something like this. And then once you have that, you know, I always like to continue it like this. And then, so this portion here, again, this is this portion right there. So the bone's going to start here, but in between, you know, in between the hand itself and the wrist is kind of like an empty space here. So I'll get kind of like this small dip here, and then the arm straight down. So now that I have this, I can turn this into a 3-dimensional shape. So now that I've added a little bit of shading so that we can understand this volume better, let's go ahead and attach the thumb. So this is going to be kind of like the middle, the center here. I've added kind of like the transparency a little bit to this. And so starting from the center here, trace a straight line again, so outwards. So in this case, you know, this portion of the thumb is going to be coming towards us, and the thumb is going to then bend towards the inside. And so this ellipse, this initial ellipse, is going to be coming from this side towards us, and, you know, attaching onto this side here. So the line is going to go like something like this. And so the ellipse is going to be more like from this particular angle, more like a circle, because it's coming directly at us. And then we'll have the other ellipse for the tip of the thumb. And then from there, right about this point right here, kind of like behind, you know, behind this first ellipse that we drew, we remember that there's supposed to be this portion here. So the ellipse is essentially this right there, with this part of the metacarpal, which should be around this point here. So right behind this ellipse. So about right there. And then from this, what we can draw now is a circle kind of going from here and wrapping this up together. So a nice circle like this to indicate the mass of the muscle here. So now it's getting super messy, so we can start to clean up a little bit here. So those lines on the outside we're not going to need really. I can start to erase that. I can start to erase this portion here at the bottom, because we've already found out that this mass here, this circle, is going to be acting as like the muscle part for the thumb. And well, if I now connect all these, we'll have kind of like the thumb and then merging into this one here, the nail, just like that. All right, and so now I have kind of like this bump here, so we'll need to make that flow into the rest of the arm, into the rest of the hands rather. Now we're going to create kind of like the starting point for all the different fingers. So the ellipses are going to start from there, and then I can just go ahead and draw those ellipses. Again, the size of the ellipse, right? So I have the total length of my palm right there, so it's about half of that. And then finally, the last section. So similar sized ellipse that we are going to turn into, remember, into a bean. All right, so there you go. So now I have kind of good construction for my hand, and you can already tell that, you know, it actually flows quite well already. It didn't take me much time, and by using those two ellipses instead of, you know, all the other techniques that show kind of like cylinders, and it just makes things really, really long to construct. With spheres like this, if you're not spheres, with ellipses like this, if you're not happy, you can easily change, you can easily tweak, adjust the different positions, and it just works really well. So now from this point on, well, all that we need to do really is adjust the bean shape. Then once we have kind of like a good enough shape for the beans, you know, split the beans in half. And again, you know, it's almost as if it was a cylinder. So, and we always have to pay attention to the angles. So if I were to draw a circle around that cylinder, it would be like this. It wouldn't be like this, right? So that would mean that the finger is kind of going in that direction, and it would mean that the nail would be kind of like this, which is not the case. So instead, it's oriented in the complete opposite direction. It's coming towards us, And this is what those circles here, or those curves, indicate. And then finally, when we're in a good spot like we are right now, well, we can start to actually clean this thing up. So what I'm going to do is just create a new layer, and we're going to draw on top of this, just clean our lines and trying to basically connect everything, you know, the way it should be. All right, so I'm going to stop here, but once you're satisfied with your result, and you can just, you know, just do line art, you don't have to go this far. One good way to check your work and to make sure that the flow of your movement, that the gesture of your hands actually good, is to check with this line here, these curves, you know, that we've drawn before. So if you can trace a nice curve, a nice continuous curve between all the joints, all the major joints of the fingers, and actually pretty much all the joints of the fingers, you know, doesn't quite apply as much with the thumb, but for these at least, if you can trace a nice continuous line that essentially touches every single one of those joints, should be in a good spot as far as the gesture goes. In my case, you know, it's not super natural. I could have definitely improved that. And this is something, you know, once you're at a stage where it's only a bunch of ellipses, you can definitely do that exercise here to make sure that all your ellipses are kind of like lined up nicely. And so this is a good step. You know, this is a good way to check yourself. You don't know exactly to tell if your hand's correct or not. If you don't have anybody to let you know, you can definitely use this technique here. And if you're not good at tracing a line like this, a continuous line, you can definitely go ahead and use the pen tool. So, you know, first line, second line, kind of try to match it so that it, you know, it connects with all the different joints. If it doesn't, no big deal. You know, you can always adjust the different length. Make sure, you know, maybe if this was too high, well, you can just drop it, make it lower so that it all lands on the same line as it should. This is going to be it for the chapter on hands, and now we're going to move on to the lower part of the body into the next chapter. I'll see you then.